Has anyone ever told you how London died? Not from war, not from plague, from a spark in a bakery. I know, because I was there. I want to tell you how a city dies, not from war, not from plague, not from the hand of God or the fury of an army, from a spark, one spark, in a bakery, on a street so narrow 2 men could not walk abreast without turning sideways. I know this because I was there. I was the one who smelled it first. My name is Thomas. That is all I will give you. Thomas, a common name, a nothing name, the kind of name that belongs to 1,000 men in any English city in any century, and gets carved on no monument, and appears in no history. I was 17 years old in September of 1666. I was an apprentice, a baker's apprentice, in the shop of Thomas Fariner. Yes, another Thomas, the world is full of us, on Pudding Lane, near Fish Street Hill, in the parish of St. Magnus the Martyr, in the city of London. I had flour under my fingernails. I had burns on my forearms from the oven. I had the kind of tiredness that lives in your lower back and never fully leaves, because a baker's apprentice does not sleep the way other men sleep. A baker's apprentice sleeps in pieces. 2 hours here, 3 hours there, between the kneading and the proving and the baking and the selling and the cleaning and the kneading again. You learn to sleep standing up, leaning against a wall, with your hands still white from flour and your eyes half open. You learn to dream in the smell of bread. I want to tell you about Pudding Lane, because you need to understand the lane to understand the fire, and you need to understand the fire to understand what happened to me. And what happened to me is not important. Not really. Not in the way that history is important. But I am telling it anyway because I was there. And the men who write histories were not. And there are things that histories do not hold. Things that fall through the cracks of dates and numbers, and the names of lords and kings. Things like the smell. Things like the sound. Things like the way a boy of 17 felt when he looked out a window and saw the sky turn the color of hell. Pudding Lane was narrow. I have said that already. But I need to say it again, because narrow is the whole story. Narrow is why it happened. Narrow is why it spread. Narrow is why London burned. The houses on Pudding Lane leaned toward each other across the street, like drunken men sharing a secret. Their upper stories jutted out over the cobbles, each floor extending a little further than the one below, until at the top, the eaves nearly touched, and the sky was just a thin ribbon of light between the roof lines. And the houses were made of wood. Everything was made of wood. The walls, the floors, the beams, the stairs, the window frames, the shutters, the signs that hung over the shop doors, the fences between the yards, the sheds, the privies, the piles of kindling stacked against the back walls, wood and pitch and tar and straw and cloth and tallow, and all the things that make a city work and all the things that make a city burn. We lived inside our fuel. We slept inside our fuel. We just did not know it yet. I want to tell you about London before the fire. The London that burned. The London I loved. Because I loved it. I want that said. Despite the filth and the crowds and the noise and the rats and the stink of the Thames at low tide, which was a smell that could strip paint from a wall. Despite all of it, I loved the city. I loved it the way you love a person who is difficult. Not because of the beauty, because of the life. London in 1666 was the year after the plague. I need to tell you that because the plague matters. The plague is the thing that came before the fire, the way the earthquake came before Vesuvius, the way the sickness came before the siege of Tenochtitlan. The plague had come the year before. The Great Plague, the one that killed 100,000 Londoners in a single summer, the one that emptied the streets and filled the pits and sent the king fleeing to Oxford and left the city in the hands of the dying and the brave and the poor who had nowhere else to go. I survived the plague. I do not know how. I do not know why. I was on Pudding Lane the whole time. I baked bread the whole time. I breathed the same air and drank the same water and walked the same streets as the men and women who died in their beds with the purple tokens on their skin and the word "Lord, have mercy on us" painted on their doors. I survived. And now, a year later, the city was coming back. Slowly, painfully. The way a man comes back from a long illness, thinner, weaker, but standing. The markets were reopening. The ships were returning to the wharves. The coffee houses were filling again with men arguing about trade and politics and the Dutch War. London was breathing again. And then the fire came, and the city that had survived the plague could not survive a spark. The shop on Pudding Lane. I should tell you about the shop, because the shop was my world, the whole of it, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, oven to counter. Master Fariner baked for the Navy, ship's biscuit, hard tack, the kind of bread that is not really bread at all, but a kind of edible stone, designed to last months at sea without molding or crumbling or doing any of the things that proper bread does. It was terrible bread. I will be honest about that. Ship's biscuit was the least beautiful thing a baker could make. No crust to speak of, no crumb, no smell. A flat, hard, joyless disk of flour and water, baked twice to drive out every drop of moisture, every whisper of softness, every memory of what bread was meant to be. But it kept sailors alive, and keeping people alive, I came to understand, was its own kind of beauty. Rose. I have mentioned Rose, the maid who would not jump. I owe you more of her before I owe you the rest. She had arrived from Suffolk in the spring, a girl from the country, 15 or 16. I was never certain, and asking a girl her age in 1666 was not something a boy did if he wanted to keep his ears. She was small, brown-haired, quick on her feet, the way country girls are, the way girls who have grown up chasing chickens and carrying water and walking 3 miles to market are. She did not walk through the house. She darted, like a sparrow. She was the only person in the household who was kind to me. I say that without self-pity. An apprentice's lot is not a kind one. The master works you. The mistress ignores you. The journeymen look through you. You are furniture. You are a pair of hands attached to a pair of arms, attached to a body that needs to be fed as cheaply as possible. Rose saw me. She saw the boy inside the apprentice. She left an extra piece of bread on the table for me after supper, when no one was looking. She mended a tear in my shirt without being asked. She sang through the wall while she swept, and the singing was meant for herself, but I heard it, and the hearing was a kind of gift. She sang songs from Suffolk, songs about harvest and rain, and a river I had never seen. The songs were simple, the words were nothing, but her voice, a thin, clear, steady voice, the voice of a girl who sang the way she breathed, without thinking about it. Her voice was the kindest sound in the house. I didn't love her. I was 17. I didn't know what love was. I knew what kindness was. And Rose was kind. And kindness in a house where there was no kindness was a thing you did not forget. I did not forget. I have not forgotten. Saturday night, the 1st of September, I should have been asleep. It was past midnight. The ovens had been banked hours ago, the fires raked down to coals, the dampers closed, the last loaves pulled and set to cool on the long wooden trays that ran the length of the back wall. The shop was dark. The street was dark. The whole city was dark, because London at midnight in 1666 was a darkness so complete that you could hold your hand in front of your face and not see it. No gas, no electricity, no street lamps, just the occasional candle in a window, or the lantern of a watchman making his rounds, calling the hour in a voice that echoed off the close walls and died in the alleys. I should have been asleep. I was not asleep because of the heat. September had been dry, desperately dry. Weeks without rain. The gutters were empty. The wells were low. The timber of the houses had dried and cracked and warped in the heat until the whole city creaked like a ship in a slow wind. You could feel the dryness on your skin, in your throat, in the way the floorboards groaned under your feet, as though the wood were thirsty and blaming you for it. I lay on my pallet in the room above the bakehouse, staring at the ceiling beams, and I could not sleep because the air was too thick and too hot and too still, the kind of air that sits on your chest like a hand. And then I smelled it. Smoke has a language. I did not know that before the fire. I know it now. There is the smoke of a hearth, familiar, warm, the smell of home, of cooking, of bread rising and meat turning on a spit. There is the smoke of a candle just blown out, sharp, brief, a small death, quickly forgotten. And there is the smoke of something wrong, something burning that should not be burning, something catching that was never meant to catch. That smoke has a different taste, a different weight. It moves differently in the air. It does not drift. It creeps. It slides under doors and through cracks in floorboards and up through the gaps between wall planks. And it finds you, and it wraps its fingers around your throat before you understand what it is. That was the smoke I smelled. Not bread smoke, not hearth smoke, wrong smoke. I sat up on my pallet. I put my feet on the floor. The floor was warm, not hot, not yet, but warm. The way a living thing is warm, the way skin is warm. I stood there in the dark, barefoot, in my shirt, with the warm floor under my feet and the wrong smoke in my nose. And I thought, very calmly, very slowly, the way you think when the thinking part of your brain has not yet caught up with the animal part that already knows. "The house is on fire," I shouted. "That is what you do. That is all you can do. You open your mouth and you push out the largest sound your body can make, and you hope that the sound reaches someone before the fire does." I shouted the master's name, Fariner. I shouted for the maid. I shouted for his daughter. I shouted, "Fire, fire, fire." And the word came out of me, not as a word, but as a sound. A raw, ugly animal sound. The sound of a boy who is suddenly and completely awake, in a way he has never been awake before. They came out of their rooms, stumbling, half-dressed, eyes wide in the dark. The smoke was thicker now. You could see it, even without light. You could see it moving, a living gray presence in the hallway, rolling along the ceiling like an upside-down river. Fariner went downstairs. He came back up immediately. His face had changed. It was not a face I recognized. It was the face of a man who has just looked at something he cannot fix. "The bakehouse is gone," he said. "The whole of the ground floor. We cannot go down." We stood there, the four of us, in the hallway, above a fire, and the floor under our feet was getting warmer. We went out the window. I need to say that plainly, because it sounds simple, and it was not simple. The window of the upper story, Farriner's bedroom. It faced the back, over the yard, and from the sill you could reach, if you leaned out far enough, if you did not look down, the gutter of the house next door. The houses were that close. Close enough to kill us. Close enough to save us. Farriner went first, then his daughter, then me. The maid would not go. She stood at the window and looked down at the yard. 3 stories, maybe 25 feet, the cobbles invisible in the dark. And she shook her head. I said, "You must come. The fire is coming up." She shook her head again. Her hands were on the windowsill. Her knuckles were white. Her eyes were very wide, and in them I could see the reflection of something orange behind me, below me, rising. "I cannot," she said. "You must." "I cannot. I cannot. I'm afraid." I reached for her hand. She pulled back, and the floor behind her began to glow. Not flame, not yet, but a glow. A deep orange glow coming up through the cracks between the boards, as though the floor were a lantern and someone had just lit the candle inside it. I said her name. I said it one more time. She did not move, and I went. Because the heat was on my back, and the smoke was in my lungs, and the animal in me said, "Go. Go now. Go or die." And I went. I went across the gutter to the next house. I went through a window that was not mine, into a room that was not mine, past people who were just waking up, just starting to smell what I had smelled, just starting to understand. And behind me, the bakehouse on Pudding Lane began to burn in earnest. And the maid did not come out. I think about her. I want you to know that. I think about her every night before I sleep. The way I have slept every night since, in pieces, 2 hours here, 3 hours there, the way a baker's apprentice sleeps. I think about her. Her name was Rose. She was perhaps 20. She had come from the country. Suffolk, I think. She had been in Farriner's house for less than a year. She was quiet. She did her work. She did not complain. She had a way of singing to herself very softly while she swept. Old songs, country songs, songs that sounded like green fields and rain, and I had liked hearing them through the wall while I worked. Rose. She would not come out the window. And I did not stay. And I have carried that across 60 years, the way a man carries a stone in his pocket. Always there, always heavy, always the first thing his hand finds when he reaches in. I could not have saved her. I know that. The fire was between us and below us, and the floor was turning to light. If I had stayed another minute, I would have died with her, and there would be one more name on the list of the dead, and no one to tell this story. But knowing that does not help. Knowing that has never helped. Outside. The street was waking up, not slowly, not the way streets normally wake, with yawns and shutters opening and the smell of breakfast. This was a different waking. This was the waking of a street that has just discovered it is on fire. People were coming out of doors, some dressed, some not, some carrying things, a chest, a box, a bolt of cloth, a child. Some carrying nothing, just themselves, just the animal instinct to be somewhere else. The fire was spreading. I could see it now, not just smell it, see it. From Farriner's bakehouse, it had jumped to the next building, and from there to the next. The buildings on Pudding Lane were so close, so dry, so full of wood and pitch and tar, that the fire did not need to leap. It simply reached, like a hand reaching across a table. It reached from one roof to the next. It reached from one wall to the next. It reached down the lane toward Thames Street. where the warehouses were. The warehouses full of oil and tallow and brandy and hay and coal. And I thought, if it reaches the warehouses. And then I stopped thinking, because thinking was slower than the fire, and the fire did not think. The fire did not plan. The fire did not hesitate. The fire just moved. I should tell you what fire sounds like. Not a fireplace fire. Not a candle. Not the controlled heat of an oven, which was the only fire I had ever known. This fire spoke. It had a voice, a roaring, crackling, hissing, breathing voice that rose and fell and rose again. And the voice said the same thing over and over. More, more, more. The fire was hungry, not the hunger of a man, a different hunger, a hunger without satisfaction, a hunger that ate and was never full, that consumed a house and reached for the next, that swallowed a street and reached for the next. Fire reaches. That is what fire does. It reaches. The sparks were how the fire traveled faster than any man could run. The east wind picked up the sparks and carried them. 100 yards, 200. The sparks sailed through the air like burning birds, riding the wind, and they landed on roofs that had been baking in the September sun for weeks. Roofs that were dry as paper. A spark lands, a roof catches, a house burns. And from that house, more sparks. And from those sparks, more roofs. The mathematics of fire, exponential, relentless. I spent the first night on the North Bank, watching. The fire had taken everything south of Thames Street by midnight. The warehouses were gone. The sugar and the oil and the brandy and the tar, all of it burning. And the colors of the fire were not the colors of ordinary fire. Blue for the brandy, green for the copper, white for the tallow, and underneath it all, the deep, reliable, constant orange of wood, the color of London burning. People were saying it was judgment, God's anger, the punishment of a sinful city. I listened to them talk, and I thought, if this is judgment, then God has a poor aim, because the fire started in a bakery, in the oven of a man who baked biscuit for the Navy, a man who went to church on Sundays and paid his taxes. If God wanted to judge London, he could have started with the King's Palace, or the brothels of Southwark. He started with a bakery. A fire started in an oven. The wind blew east. The city was made of wood. That is not judgment. That is physics. And physics does not care who deserves what. The fire moved west, toward the wealthy parts, toward Cheapside and the Guildhall. The wealthy were not ready. They had watched the fire the way they watched everything, from a distance, with the comfortable certainty that fire, like plague, like poverty, happened to other people. It did not happen to other people. It happened to everyone. The fire did not read property deeds. The fire did not check ledgers. The fire ate both. I saw a merchant on Cheapside, standing in the street, in his nightshirt, watching his house burn. He had a strongbox in his arms. The strongbox was locked. The key was inside the house. He stood there, holding the locked box, watching the key melt. And I thought, that is London. That is all of us, holding the box, watching the key burn. I saw a woman saving books near St. Paul's, carrying them out of a house, armfuls of heavy leather-bound volumes, stacking them on the cobblestones. "Let me help," I said. She looked at my bare feet, my soot-covered face. "Can you read?" she said. "No." "Then be careful with them." I carried books for an hour, books in Latin and English, and languages I could not identify. I could not read a word, but I carried them as carefully as I had ever carried anything, because the woman's face told me these were not objects. They were lives. The thoughts of dead men pressed into pages. We saved perhaps 100. The fire took the rest. Thousands of books, burning underground in the crypt of St. Paul's, the words turning to smoke, the knowledge of centuries rising through the stone floor. The woman sat on the cobblestones beside her 100 saved books and put her face in her hands. I sat beside her. I did not know her name. She did not know mine. We sat beside the books, and the fire moved on. I should tell you about London, not the London of the histories, not the London of kings and palaces and great stone churches. The London I knew, the London that burned. It was a city of wood. I have said that. But it was more than that. It was a city of closeness, of tightness, of everything pressed against everything else. 300,000 people, maybe more, packed into a space that was barely a mile across in any direction. Houses stacked on top of houses, shops built onto shops, rooms divided and subdivided until a family of 6 lived in a space the size of a horse stall. The streets were not streets. They were gaps. Narrow, crooked, unpaved gaps between buildings that had grown up over centuries without plan or order, each one leaning on the next, each one sharing a wall or a beam or a chimney with its neighbor. And under the streets, in the cellars and basements, coal, wood, pitch, tar, stored by the barrel, by the ton. The city was a bonfire that had not yet been lit, and on the 1st of September, someone lit it. Or rather, an oven that had not been properly banked, in a bakery on Pudding Lane, on a night so hot and dry that the air itself seemed to be waiting for an excuse. The excuse came. The first hours were confusion. Nobody believed it would spread. That is the thing I remember most clearly about those first hours. The disbelief, the shrugging, the certainty, absolute, unshakable, English certainty, that a fire on Pudding Lane was a fire on Pudding Lane, and would stay on Pudding Lane, and would be put out by morning. The Lord Mayor was roused from his bed and brought to see it. I was not there when he came, but I heard what he said. Everyone heard what he said, because it became the kind of sentence that people repeat to each other in the days after, when they are looking for someone to blame. He looked at the fire, he looked at the burning houses, and he said, "Pish, a woman might piss it out." And he went back to bed. By dawn, 30 houses were gone. By noon, Fish Street Hill was burning. By evening, Thames Street was gone, and the warehouses had caught, and the oil was burning, and the tallow was burning, and the brandy was burning, and the fire was no longer a fire. It was a beast with 100 mouths and 1,000 hands, feeding on everything it touched, growing larger with every hour, throwing sparks into the dry wind that carried them 100 yards, 200 yards, and dropped them on roofs that had been waiting all summer to burn. I stood on the north bank of the river at sunset that first day, and I watched the sky. The sky was not the sky anymore. It was a ceiling, a low, rolling, orange-black ceiling of smoke and heat, and through it, from beneath, the glow of the fire lit the clouds from below, and the clouds looked like the belly of some enormous creature lying on its back above the city. And the belly was on fire, and the creature was not moving, and the light of it was so bright that you could read a letter by it at midnight. The heat, even from the river, even from the far bank, you could feel the heat. It came across the water in waves, like the heat from an oven door, like the heat I had felt 1,000 times in the bakehouse, but larger, impossibly larger, the heat of an oven the size of a city. My face was warm, my eyes watered from the smoke, my lungs felt tight, and the fire was half a mile away, The people. Again, the people. Always the people. They were leaving. All of them. In every direction. By every road, every alley, every gate. On foot. On carts. On boats in the river. Carrying everything they could hold and leaving everything they could not. I saw a woman carrying a bird cage. The bird inside was singing. I saw a man pulling a handcart piled so high with furniture that it toppled at a corner and the furniture spilled across the cobbles, and he stood there looking at it, at the chairs and the table and the rolled-up carpet, and the small portrait of someone I did not recognize. And he stood there for maybe 5 seconds, and then he left it all and kept walking with nothing. I saw children separated from their parents, standing in the crowd, turning, looking, their mouths open, saying mama, saying papa, saying the words into the noise and the smoke and the crush of bodies. And sometimes a hand would reach down and find them, and sometimes it would not. I saw an old man sitting on a stone step with his head in his hands, not moving, not speaking, while the crowd flowed around him like water around a rock, and nobody stopped, because nobody could stop, because stopping meant being swallowed by the crowd behind you, and the crowd behind you was being pushed by the fire behind them. The crowd was the river now. The crowd was the current. You did not walk. You were carried. I had nowhere to go. I need to say that, because it changes the shape of the story. The others, the families, the merchants, the tradesmen, they had somewhere. A cousin in Southwark, a brother in Islington, a friend beyond the walls, somewhere to carry their bird cages and their portraits and their children. I had no one. My mother had died when I was 9. My father had sent me to London when I was 12 to learn a trade, because there was nothing for me in the village, and he could not feed me. An apprenticeship was better than starving. He had shaken my hand at the coach, not embraced me, shaken my hand, because he was that kind of man, a handshaking man, a man who kept his feelings behind a door he never opened. And he had said, "Work hard, do not steal, say your prayers." That was the last I saw of him. I had written to him twice. He had not written back. I did not know if he was alive or dead. I did not know if the village was still there. I knew nothing about the world beyond the bakehouse on Pudding Lane, because the bakehouse was my world, and the bakehouse was gone. So I stood on the riverbank with nothing, no family, no money, no possessions, not even shoes. I had come out the window in my shirt and my stockings were now black with soot and torn at the knees from scrambling across roof gutters. I was 17 years old. I was standing in my shirt. The city was burning behind me, and I had nowhere to go. I went toward the fire. I do not know why. I should have gone the other way. I should have done what everyone else was doing. Walked north, walked east, walked away, walked anywhere that was not toward the burning. But I went toward it. Perhaps because I had nothing to carry away. Perhaps because a boy with nothing to save is a boy with nothing to lose. Perhaps because somewhere in the animal part of me, deeper than fear, there was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or duty, or the simple, stupid, beautiful human need to see, to be a witness, to stand where the thing is happening and say, "I was here. I saw this. This was real." The fire ate London in bites. That is how it felt. Not a single great conflagration, not a wave, but bites, street by street, house by house. The fire would take a building, consume it, hollow it out from the inside until the roof fell in and the walls collapsed and a fountain of sparks went up into the dark sky. And then it would reach for the next one, and the next one, and the next. I watched houses I had walked past every day of my apprenticeship disappear. The chandler's shop where I bought candles, the tavern on the corner where the old men sat and argued about the Dutch War, the barber's shop where I had been shaved for the first time at 16, the barber's hand steady and the razor cold on my jaw, and I had felt, for one moment, like a man. Gone. The barber's shop, the cold razor, the feeling of being a man, all of it, gone into the fire, gone into the smoke, gone into the air above London that smelled of everything at once, wood and pitch and tar and wool, and leather and bread and meat, and wine and paper and straw and life, the smell of a city being rendered down to its elements. Sunday night, Monday, Monday night, Tuesday. The fire burned for 4 days. I do not have them in order. I am not sure anyone does. The days bled into each other, separated not by dawn and dusk, but by which part of the city was burning, and which part was not yet burning, and which part had already burned, and was now just ash and smoking timber, and the black skeletons of chimneys standing alone in fields of rubble like gravestones. I slept when I could, in churchyards, on the grass of moorfields north of the wall, where thousands of others were also sleeping, or trying to sleep, lying on the ground under the open sky with their bundles and their children and their terror. I ate when I could. A stranger gave me bread on the Monday, a woman I did not know. She was sitting on a stone by the road with a cloth bundle in her lap, and she saw me, saw my bare feet, my soot-blackened face, my shirt torn at the shoulder, and she reached into her bundle and took out a piece of bread and held it out to me without a word. I took it. I ate it standing there in the road, and it was the best bread I had ever tasted, and I was a baker's apprentice, and I had tasted a great deal of bread. I did not thank her properly. I was too tired, too hollow. I said something. I do not remember what, and she nodded, and I walked on. I think about her too, the woman with the bread, another stranger in the fire, another face I cannot quite see when I close my eyes, but can almost see, almost, like a word on the tip of the tongue. The churches burned. That was the thing that made people stop and stare, even when they had stopped staring at everything else. The churches, old churches, ancient churches, churches that had been standing since before anyone alive could remember, churches with stones laid in the time of the Normans, churches where generations had been baptized and married and buried, churches whose bells had rung the hours of London's days for centuries. They burned. I watched St. Magnus go, the parish church of my own street, the church where I had sat on Sundays in the back pew, trying not to doze while the rector preached about sins I had not yet had the opportunity to commit. The roof went first. The lead of the roof melted. I saw it run. I saw the molten lead streaming down the walls like silver tears, pooling on the ground, hissing. And then the timbers of the roof caught, and the flames shot up through the empty space where the roof had been, and the stained glass blew out in a shower of colored fragments that fell on the street, like a ruined rainbow. And then the walls, and then the tower. The tower fell slowly, almost gently. It leaned and leaned, and then it came down in a great roar of stone and dust, and the ground shook, and I felt it through my bare feet, and the people around me cried out, and someone said, "God help us." And someone else said, "God is not helping." I saw St. Paul's burn, the great cathedral, the old cathedral, not the one that stands now, the one that came before, the one with the spire that had been struck by lightning 100 years before and never rebuilt, The one with the nave so long you could lose yourself in it. The one where the booksellers kept their stock in the crypt, thousands of books, locked away for safekeeping when the fire came close. The books burned. The books burned first, underground, in the crypt. The heat found them through the stone. And the books, all that paper, all those words, all those years of thought and prayer and argument and poetry, the books caught fire inside their tomb, and the crypt became an oven, and the heat rose through the floor of the cathedral, and the floor cracked, and the stones exploded, and the cathedral began to die from the inside out. I watched it from Ludgate Hill, the roof, the lead, the streaming silver, the timbers, the flames, and the stones of the walls, the great old stones laid by men whose names were forgotten. The stones cracked in the heat and flew apart, and pieces of them landed 100 yards away, and each piece sounded, when it hit the ground, like a cannon shot. The noise was beyond description. It was not the crackling of a fire. It was the roaring of a furnace the size of a cathedral. The air itself was on fire. The air above St. Paul's was burning, a column of heat so intense that it created its own wind, a howling, screaming, vertical wind that sucked debris up from the ground and hurled it into the smoke. I stood and watched the greatest church in London die, and I wept. Not because I was devout. I was 17. I was not particularly devout. I wept because it was beautiful. I wept because it had been beautiful, and now it was something else. And the something else was also beautiful, in the terrible way that destruction is beautiful, when it is so complete that it becomes a kind of creation. A creation of nothing, of emptiness, of the space where a thing used to be. Tuesday night, the wind died. That is how it ended. Not with a great act of heroism, not with some clever plan or some brave stand. The wind died. The east wind that had been blowing for days, the wind that had carried the sparks and fed the flames and pushed the fire westward through the city like a hand pushing a child on a swing. The wind dropped, and without the wind, the fire slowed. And the fire breaks that men had been cutting, pulling down houses with hooks and ropes, blowing them up with gunpowder, creating gaps too wide for the fire to cross. The fire breaks held, and the fire stopped. Not all at once, not cleanly. The fire did not surrender. It smoldered. It flared up in places. It hid in cellars and crawled through the rubble and spat sparks from the ashes for days afterward. But it stopped spreading, and people stood in the streets that were left, and they looked at each other, and they breathed, and the breathing was the loudest sound in London. I walked through the burned city on the Wednesday. I do not know why I am telling you this part. Perhaps because it is the part that has stayed with me the longest. Not the fire itself, not the flames, not the heat, or the smoke, or the noise, the silence after. The city was still warm. The ground was warm under my feet. In places, too warm to stand on. I had to pick my way along the edges of streets, stepping on stones that had cooled enough to bear a bare foot. The landmarks were gone. All of them. I could not tell where I was. I, who had known every lane, every alley, every turning of the city, could not tell where I was, because the city was flat. Everything was flat. The houses, the shops, the churches, the taverns, the warehouses, all of it leveled, reduced to ash and rubble and the black stumps of chimneys. The chimneys. Thousands of chimneys, standing alone in the flatness, like dead trees in a burned forest, each one marking the place where a house had been, where a family had lived, where children had been born and old men had died, and women had hung laundry to dry. I walked among the chimneys. I walked through a city of chimneys and silence and warm ash. The heat lingered for days, even after the fire stopped spreading, even after the wind died and the fire breaks held, and the flames retreated into sullen embers. The ground was hot. The rubble was hot. The ash was hot. London was a city of heat, baked by 4 days of fire into something that was not quite solid and not quite liquid, a landscape that crunched and shifted and smoked under your feet. I walked carefully, slowly, picking my way through streets I could no longer identify by anything except the general direction. I navigated by the river, the way I had navigated the night of the fire. The Arno, no, the Thames. The Thames was still there. The Thames did not burn. The Thames flowed through the ruins, the way it had flowed before the fire, and before the plague, and before the Romans, and before anyone, and the water did not care that the city on its banks was gone. Water does not care. Water just flows. I found things, in the rubble, in the ash, a spoon, blackened, twisted by the heat, but still a spoon, still the shape a hand holds, a key. Whose key? Whose door? The door was gone. The house was gone. The lock was gone. But the key remained. Iron survives fire. Iron holds its shape when everything else melts. The key lay in my palm like a small dead animal. I put it in my pocket. I do not know why. I still have it, 60 years later. A key that opens nothing. A key whose door no longer exists. But I keep it, because the key was someone's way home. Someone's promise that the house would be there when they came back. The house was not there, but the key is. And sometimes the key is enough. Sometimes the key is all that survives. The key and the bread and the singing and the memory of a city made of wood. The key and the names. The key and the love. The key. The smell of the burned city was not what I expected. I expected the smell of wood, of charcoal, of ash. Those smells were there, but underneath them, deeper, stranger, was the smell of everything else. The smell of melted lead from the church roofs, a metallic tang that sat on the tongue like a coin. The smell of burned books, paper and leather and ink. A dry, bitter, intellectual smell. The smell of thought itself being consumed. The smell of cellars that had contained wine and now contained vapor. The ghost of 1,000 bottles that had burst in the heat and soaked into the earth and would probably make the soil drunk for years. And underneath all of it, underneath every other smell, the faint, lingering, unmistakable sweetness of bread. Burned bread. From the ovens. From Ferner's ovens. From my ovens. The ovens where I had baked for 5 years. The ovens where the fire had started. The ovens that had been the first thing to burn, and were now somewhere under the rubble of Pudding Lane, buried, cooling, holding the ghost of the last loaves I had ever made in that place. I smelled the bread, and I wept. Not for the city, not for the 13,000 houses, not for the 87 churches, or St. Paul's or the Royal Exchange or the Guildhall, for the bread, for the ordinary, daily, meaningless, beautiful bread that I had made with my hands in a city that no longer existed, for the bread. And I came to Pudding Lane, or where Pudding Lane had been. There was nothing, not even a chimney. The fire had started here, and it had been most thorough here. The lane was gone. The bakehouse was gone. The room where I had slept was gone. The oven was gone, somewhere under the rubble, buried. The oven where I had baked bread every morning for 5 years. The oven whose heat I knew the way. I knew the heat of my own body. I stood there. I stood in the place where Rose had stood at the window and shaken her head and said I cannot. And I said her name, once, quietly, into the warm air, and the warm air took it and gave me nothing back. 13,000 houses. That is the number they settled on, eventually. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, St. Paul's Cathedral, hundreds of streets, whole neighborhoods, whole parishes, whole centuries of building and living and growing, all of it undone in 4 days by a spark in a bakery on a street so narrow 2 men could not walk abreast. 13,000 houses. I cannot hold that number. It is too large. It is a number for histories and records and the reports of committees. I can hold one house, the house on Pudding Lane, with the oven in the back, and the flour on the floor, and the long wooden trays where the loaves cooled, and the room upstairs where I slept on a pallet that smelled of yeast, and the window where Rose stood and would not jump. One house. That is all I can hold. They rebuilt. Of course they rebuilt. They rebuilt in stone this time, in brick. They widened the streets. They wrote new laws. No more wooden houses, no more overhanging stories, no more pitch on the walls. They built a new St. Paul's, bigger and grander, with a dome that could be seen from the river. They built a monument, a tall stone column near where the bakehouse had stood, and they put an inscription on it that blamed the fire on the papists, which was a lie, but lies are easier to carve in stone than the truth, which is that nobody was to blame, that an oven was to blame, that the wind was to blame, that the dryness was to blame, that the narrowness was to blame, that the wood was to blame, that the city itself was to blame for being so old and so crowded and so lovely and so made of fuel. They rebuilt. But the city they built was not the city I had known. It was better, probably, safer, wider, more sensible. But it was not the same city. The same city had been narrow and crooked and leaning and dark, and it had smelled of bread and fish and river and smoke, and it had been alive in a way that the new city, with its straight streets and its stone facades, would never be. The old city had been an animal, warm, breathing, crowded with heartbeats. The new city was a machine, clean, ordered, correct. I lived in the new city for a while. I found work, another bakery, another oven, another master. I kneaded and proved and baked and sold, and the bread was the same, and the flour was the same, and the heat of the oven was the same. But the city was not the same, and I was not the same. I married, eventually. A woman named Margaret, a good woman, a widow. She'd lost her husband to the plague the year before the fire, because London in those years was a place that killed you twice, first with sickness, then with flame, and the survivors of the one walked straight into the other, and some of them survived that too, and those were the ones who married each other, because who else would understand? Margaret understood. She did not ask me about the fire, not once, in all our years together. She saw it in my face sometimes. I know she did. I saw her seeing it. But she did not ask. She would put her hand on my arm, quietly, the way you put your hand on a dog that is shaking. And I would stop shaking, and we would go on with the day. She was the kind of woman who understood that some things do not need to be said, that some stories are not told but carried, that a man can carry a fire inside him for his whole life, and the carrying does not make him weak. She made me warm. After a year of cold, sleeping in churchyards and on the grass of moorfields, and in doorways of buildings that were not mine, Margaret made me warm. She gave me a home, a small room above a chandler's shop in Southwark, south of the river, where the fire had not reached. A small room, a bed, a table, a window. We sat in that room. We ate bread. We drank ale. We did not talk about the fire. We talked about the future, about the shop I would open, about the bread I would bake, about the life we would build on the other side of the burning. We had children, 3, 2 boys and a girl. I taught the boys the trade, the bread, the flour, the oven. I taught them to bank the fires properly. I taught them to check the dampers twice. I taught them to check the flue. I taught them things that no one had taught me, because no one had thought they were important, because everyone had assumed the fires would take care of themselves. They do not take care of themselves. Nothing takes care of itself. You have to tend it, watch it, stay awake when the world is sleeping and the heat is thick and the air is still and everything is made of wood. You have to stay awake. My daughter's name was Rose. I did not plan that. Margaret chose the name. She liked the sound of it. I did not tell her why I flinched when she said it. I did not tell her for years. And when I finally did, one evening by the fire, after the children were in bed, with a cup of ale in my hand and the embers low, I told her about the window, about the gutter, about the girl from Suffolk who sang through the wall, about the orange glow coming up through the floorboards, about the hand I reached for, the hand that pulled back. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You were 17. Yes. The floor was on fire. Yes. And she would not jump. She would not jump. Thomas," she took my hand, "you were a boy, in a fire, on a roof, in the dark, and you did what a boy in a fire can do. You survived." She did not. No, she did not. And that is not your fault. That is the fire's fault. I looked at our daughter, asleep in the next room. The door was open. I could see her face in the candlelight. "I named her for the sound of it," Margaret said quietly. "Rose is a singing name." She was right. And our Rose sang. Not the same songs. Not the songs from Suffolk. London songs. Songs of a new city being built on the ashes of the old. But singing. Always singing. I tried. I've been trying for 60 years. Some nights I succeed. I am old now. My hands shake. Not from cold, from age, from the accumulated tremor of 60 years of mourning spent reaching into ovens, pulling out bread, feeding a city that does not remember it burned. Margaret is gone. She died in the winter, quietly, in her sleep, the way she did most things, without asking for permission, without waiting to be told. I held her hand. It was warm. Margaret's hand was always warm, even at the end. The new city stands where the old one stood. I walk through it sometimes, through the wide stone streets that replace the narrow wooden lanes, past the new St. Paul's with its dome. Wren's dome, they call it. The dome that a man designed to replace what the fire took. And the dome is beautiful. I will grant it that. The dome is a masterpiece. But it is not the old St. Paul's. The old St. Paul's had a spire, a tall, crooked, lightning-struck spire that leaned slightly to the east, as though it were listening to something, as though the church were tilting its ear toward God. The new dome does not lean. The new dome is perfect, symmetrical, correct. I miss the lean. I miss the imperfection. I miss the city that was crooked and narrow and leaning and dark and alive. I still bake. Not every day. Not the way I used to. But some mornings I get up before the sun and I light the oven and I mix the dough and I shape the loaves and I put them in the heat and I wait and the smell fills the house. And for a moment, just the space of one breath, I am 17 again. On Pudding Lane, in the bakehouse, before the spark, and the bread is rising, and Rose is singing through the wall, and the city outside the window is dark and narrow and crooked and made of wood and alive, and nothing is burning yet. I say their names, at night, before sleep, in the dark, the ones I knew, the ones I did not. Rose, who would not jump, who sang songs from Suffolk, who was kind to a boy who had no one. Fariner, who went to the window first so the rest of us could follow. The woman who gave me bread on the road, whose face I almost remember. The woman who saved books, who sat on the cobblestones, whose name I never learned. The old man on the stone step with his head in his hands. The children calling for their mothers in the crowd. The merchant with the locked box, watching the key melt. The barber with the cold razor, whose shop is under the new street. The bird in the cage that would not stop singing, even when the city burned. Margaret, who put her hand on my arm, who understood, who named our daughter for the sound of singing. The city, the old city, the one made of wood, the one that breathed, the one that leaned. There is a monument now, on the spot where the bakehouse stood, a tall stone column, 202 feet high, with an inscription at the base that tells you the fire started here and spread and destroyed 13,200 houses and 87 churches and covered 436 acres. The numbers. The monument gives you the numbers. It does not give you the names. It does not tell you about Rose, about the woman with the bread, about the merchant with the locked box, about the bird that would not stop singing. Monuments hold numbers. Names are held by people. And when the people are gone, the names have to find their own way. Which is why I'm telling you now, before I close the shop, before I climb the stairs, so that the names do not have to find their own way alone, I want to tell you one last thing, one thing, and then I will let the fire go out. The bread survived, not the loaves, not the flour, not the oven, the knowledge, the way you mix the water and the yeast, the way you knead until the dough springs back, the way you shape it with your palms, the way you know by touch, by smell, by the sound it makes when you tap the bottom of the loaf, that it is done. The fire took the city. It took the houses and the churches and the streets and the people and the books and the windows and the narrow, leaning, beautiful, impossible, fuel-soaked city that I loved. It did not take the bread. The bread is still here. I am still making it. Every loaf I pull from the oven is an answer, not a loud answer, not a defiant answer, a quiet one, a flour-dusted, warm-crusted, yeast-risen answer to the fire that took 13,000 houses and 87 churches, and the old St. Paul's with its leaning spire, and the books in the crypt, and the narrow streets and the leaning buildings and rows. The fire took all of that, and every morning I make bread, and the bread rises, and the rising is the answer, because bread does not know about fire. Bread does not know about plague. Bread does not know about the Great Fire of London, or the year 1666, or the east wind, or the spark on Pudding Lane. Bread knows about yeast, and water, and flour, and heat. And heat, the same heat that burned the city, is the heat that bakes the bread. The same element, the same force, the same fire, used differently. That is the only lesson I have. If a boy of 17 who became a man of 77 has anything to teach after 60 years of mourning spent reaching into ovens, the lesson is this: Fire is fire. It does not choose. It does not judge. It does not decide to burn a bakery or spare a cathedral or take a girl who would not jump. Fire burns. That is all fire does. And the same fire, the very same fire, the same orange heat, the same dancing light, the same fire that destroyed London is the fire that bakes the bread that feeds London. The destroyer and the creator are the same. They always were. The difference is the oven. The difference is the walls you put around the fire, the dampers you close, the flue you check, the care you take. The difference is the tending. The difference is staying awake. I am going to close the shop now. It is late. The ovens are cooling. The last loaves are on the counter, wrapped in cloth for the morning. The flour has been swept, badly probably, because every apprentice I have ever trained sweeps badly, and I have stopped fighting it, because badly swept floors are the price of being a master, and the price is worth paying. I'm going to close the shop. I'm going to climb the stairs. I'm going to lie down in the bed where Margaret used to sleep, where the blankets still smell faintly of her, where the pillow still holds the shape of her head if I do not look too closely. And I am going to close my eyes, and I am going to listen. Not for the fire. The fire is 60 years gone. The fire is a memory. The fire is a story I tell to apprentices who do not believe me, who look at the wide stone streets and the brick houses and the new dome of St. Paul's and think, that could never burn. That could never happen here. It happened here. It started in this shop, in this oven, on this street. One spark, one night, one city, and everything changed. And everything came back. And everything changed again. Because that is what cities do. They burn and they rise and they burn and they rise. And the burning is part of the rising. And the rising is part of the burning and the bread that was there before the fire and will be there after. The bread is the thread that holds the burning to the rising, the thread that holds the old city to the new, the thread that holds Thomas the boy to Thomas, the man to Thomas, the old baker sitting in his shop at the end of the day, listening for a voice he has not heard in 60 years. I am not going to listen for the fire. I am going to listen for the singing. For roses singing, through the wall, the songs from Suffolk, the thin, clear, steady voice of a girl who sang the way she breathed. I have been listening for 60 years. I have not heard it. But some nights, when the house is very quiet and the city is very still, and the embers in the hearth are very low, some nights I think I almost do. Almost. And the almost is enough. It has to be enough. A spark in a bakery. That is how a city dies. And a loaf in an oven. That is how it comes back. Remember us. Remember us. Remember us.